everyone. It's good to see you. It's a blessing to be able to have this opportunity to share with you today. Um, when we thought about a speaker for February, we recognized that this is a Black History Month. Even though we celebrate Black History every day, we should be. We are Black History, so obviously, I guess we do celebrate it every day. But February is really special month for us. So we were thinking about who could we get to enlighten our scholars, our candidates. And it came to me that I work with someone every day in the School of Education who is a profound orator and writer and researcher in the field all things African and everything African. And so we are blessed to have a very sought after guest speaker. I mean, he's spoken across the world on some of the very tenets that he's going to present to you today. So we actually have a celebrity in our midst, um, Dr. Chike Akua. He's a profound instructor in the Department of Higher Education in the School of Education right across the hall from Council of Education. He actually graduated from our department as a counselor some years ago. So he really connects and has great synergy for connecting the dots with Afrocentricity, and if I'm pronouncing that correctly, and um, and the whole world of caring for other people. So if you nurses and doctors, social workers, clinical mental health professionals, and school counseling professionals, we are often gifted with a heart that other professions don't really have. And so the purpose of the session today is to help you to stay connected to who you are as a people, as a person, and carrying out your vocational goals and objectives. So you have a copy of his bio. So I want to officially present to you our magnificent, um, famous, historical researcher, writer, teacher, recently promoted to tenured associate professor in the Department of Higher Education, the School of Education, under the leadership of Dr. J. Fidel Turner Jr. I want to present Dr. Chike Akua, our speaker for the hour. Dr. Akua, the show is yours.
All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Giddings. And the feeling's definitely mutual. We have benefited so much from your wise counsel in the Department of Ed Leadership. I'll never forget the session that you did for us last summer during our summer residency for our higher education leaders. I don't see how anybody could be in any form of leadership without having some counseling background experience or some knowledge of those therapeutic approaches, especially the times that we're living in. I always like to start with what time it is, and there's a great African-American scholar by the name of Dr. Benjamin E. Mays who said it's 11:59 on the clock of destiny, and life is like a minute, only 60 seconds in it. Forced upon you, can't refuse it. Didn't seek it, didn't choose it, but it's up to you to use it. You'll suffer if you lose it. Give account if you abuse it. It's only a minute, but eternity is in it. And with that minute, you, me, and we can change and transform the world. Today, I want to speak with you all on the topic Sankofa to Saku, African-centered orientations and approaches to behavioral health. And in just a few moments, we'll explain what those words Sankofa and Saku mean if you're not already familiar with them. But before I do, I want to bring you greetings from the Department of Educational Leadership, where I am honored to serve on the faculty as associate professor. It's customary whenever we come together as a people that we begin by giving honor to the Most High, who is known by many names and worshiped in many ways. certainly the one source and the one force through which we all live, move, and have our being. The symbol that you see on your screen right now is called Gini Ame, and it's an Adinkra symbol for Africa, and it simply refers to the omnipotence of the Most High. We are a deeply spiritual people, and we must be who we are wherever we are, and tap the spirit and touch the souls of those that we serve, so that we can be our authentic selves. It's also customary when we come together that we give honor to our ancestors because there's an African proverb that says, if we stand tall, it is because we stand on the shoulders of our ancestors. Or as Dr. Jacob Carruthers has said, indeed, our stride is we're walking in the footsteps of giants. And one of the challenges that we face as educators, as counselors, as therapists, as social workers, is the fact that we are in a system that has intentionally disconnected us from our cultural and ancestral tradition. And we'll get into that because that has grave consequences for us as a people. You've heard it said before that a picture is worth 1,000 words. And if that's the case, then you're about to, in the short time that we have together, you're going to read a book of 50,000 pages because the pictures and images that I have to share with you are very, very critically important. But you can't just look with your two physical eyes. You have to look with what ancient Africans called the ujat. The ujat, some people call it the third eye, but it's really the first eye, the eye of intuition, the eye of all-seeing enlightenment that allows us to see beyond the physical realm and into the mental and spiritual dimensions. As the poet Listerville Middleton said, sharpen your eye and tune your ears so you know what you see and understand what you hear. And it is this type of insight that's critically important for counselors and therapists who are interested in healing and restoring our people. One of the things that's very, very important is questions. There's an African proverb that says, the one who asks the question doesn't lose their way. So it will be very important, as I oftentimes tell my students, I'm more interested in your questions than in your answers. So we will pause periodically to take questions and feedback because I want to see how you're receiving the information that I'm sharing with you, your thoughts, feelings, and insights about it. Um, so definitely consider the questions that you'll want to ask along the way. In addition to your questions, that's part of participation. Participation is where life happens, as one of my good friends oftentimes says. So your participation will be very, very important. I'll be asking you to put things in the chat box. I'll be asking you to unmute yourself to share your thoughts and feelings and opinions from time to time. And because time is of the essence, we won't have time for that awkward pause that happens sometimes when somebody is, people are waiting for the first person to speak up. We want you to be that first person. In addition to that, I'm going to pause periodically and say, hey, what's your aha? My presentation is broken down into several sessions. And at the end of each session, I want to know what's your aha? What's most important about what I've shared for you? How can you integrate it into your practice as a counselor, as a therapist, as a social worker? So that feedback will be very, very important. All right. I'm going to be speaking from uh, two of my books. The first one is Honoring Our Ancestral Obligations, 7 Steps to Black Student Success. And the second one is Kepra, Ancient Kemetic Concepts in Education for Transformation. Both of these books contain information that has deep implications for counselors, therapists, and social workers. And I hope that you'll see that as we move on. All right. So that being said, let's get into it. Sankofa to Saku. African-centered orientations and approaches to behavioral health. And Ms. Campbell and Dr. Giddings, I may need you to watch the chat box for me as we engage.
Okay, we will.
Here's my first question for you all. Is something wrong with this picture?
Africa is upside down.
Africa is upside down. Thank you. So we had our first participation. All right, Africa is upside down. I show this picture all over the country and in some places, instances, different places internationally. And thank you for that answer because that's the answer that I always get. And to some people, it is Africa upside down. But in reality, it depends on who's looking. So to the average person, this does look like a map of Africa upside down. But if you're looking through ancestral eyes, it's actually Africa right side up. Let me explain. Ancient Africans oriented themselves to the flow of the Nile River. And the Nile River is one of the few rivers in the world that doesn't flow from north to south, but actually flows south to north. So what we call north, they would call south. What we call south, they would call north. What we today call east, they would call west, and what we call west, they would call east. They had a completely different orientation to the world. So the reality is, this is not a map of Africa upside down. What has happened is that our culture has been turned upside down. And as a result, we look with European eyes rather than with African eyes. And that distorted view distorts our reality and distorts our perception and it distorts our experience. And until we refocus the lens through which we're viewing life, we will continue to live a life that in many ways is upside down. And by upside down, I mean not optimal in terms of the way that we're living as a people. Okay? So again, this is not Africa upside down. This is actually Africa right side up. This is how your ancestors viewed the world. And when you shift the way that you view your world, you shift your perception and you shift your experiences. And this is part of the work that counselors, therapists, and psychologists and social workers, this part of the work that we do is helping people to see a different aspect of their world so that they can live a more healthy and optimal life. There's an African proverb that says, if something is lost, we look for it first at home. If something is lost, we look for it first at home. And what I've discovered working in the Department of Educational Leadership and coming through the counselor education department as a student over 20 years ago, and even in my undergraduate studies as an education major, I was often struck by the fact that we learned all of these different viewpoints and theories and so forth from European scholars. And my perspective was they don't even have answers for themselves. How are their theories going to work for us? Now, I say that to say, it's not that others may not have some useful tools, but if something is lost, we look for it first at home. So who are the Black theorists and therapists and counselors and social workers who have looked deeply into our condition, placed it in cultural, political, spiritual context, and been able to truly facilitate healing for us as a people? So this is what we want to get to. And I'll be sharing a number of different African proverbs with you throughout this presentation because, well, there's a proverb that says, a counselor who knows proverbs soon sets difficult matters aright. A counselor who knows proverbs soon sets difficult matters aright. And proverbs contain the cultural wisdom of African people. And oftentimes it is condensed into a single sentence that becomes very profound for understanding our reality. Neely Fuller said something very interesting. He said, we're living in a time of maximum sophisticated confusion. My goodness. Let me pause right there. How do you interpret that along with the picture? How do you interpret that? Give me either unmute yourself and share, or you can type something in the chat box. What do you think he meant by this? We're living in a time of maximum sophisticated confusion. Look at the picture, look at the words, and what does that mean to you?
What I immediately thought of was how intellectualized and how just how intellectualized racism is, and how much people try to
You felt?
how much people in America try to like make sense of racism and like make it scientific and make our oppression like seem valid, if that makes sense.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. Who else can share as well? What does that mean to you?
Someone said, we are blindly oppressed, satisfied with the little bit of freedoms we get.
Blindly oppressed and satisfied with the little freedoms that we get. Okay. Well,
And someone else said, how the media is confusing us as a people and tries to dress up oppression. Wow, this is deep. And
now, I'm asking this rhetorically, Dr. Giddings, but hey, do you think that has an impact on our mental health? Maximum
yes,
sophisticated, not simple, but sophisticated confusion. There are those who benefit from our confusion.
wow.
And even today, right now, as you see the brothers' eyes are covered with the American flag, there are people who use the veneer of patriotism to further confuse us. Okay? And so what we see are weapons of mass distraction, weapons of mass deception,
Have mercy.
and weapons of mass destruction. What do I mean by weapons of mass distraction? Well, here's one of them. This phone, if used improperly, is a weapon of mass distraction. Because if we're not careful, we can be hooked on social media and so many different things. And if I'm being perfectly honest, they say confession is good for the soul, right? I could stand to be on those things less myself. If you're not careful, it becomes a weapon of mass distraction, not to mention the things circulating on social media. Then there are weapons of mass deception, absolute lies that are placed in broad circulation in society. There are lies about who we are as a people. One of the lies that's circulating right now is that we're unqualified. And the very people circulating the lies have historically been the most unqualified to hold certain positions. Weapons of mass deception, lies, okay? And what this creates is a mind that becomes a weapon of mass destruction, where we begin to consume and cannibalize ourselves as a people. And so we have to be very, very mindful that we're living in a time of maximum sophisticated confusion. Theories and therapeutic approaches are tools counselors and therapists use. And I want you to consider this very carefully. I want you to think about all of the different therapeutic approaches that you've learned and consider the different tools that a person might use. In this picture, you see a flathead screwdriver, right? In this picture, you see a Phillips head screwdriver. Now, what happens, everybody, if you try to use a Phillips head screwdriver on a screw that requires a flathead screwdriver? What's going to happen, everybody? Somebody put it in the chat box or just unmute and tell me what's going to happen.
Probably won't fit.
What's
Won't
that?
work. Said it probably won't work. It's not gonna fit.
It's not going to fit, and it probably won't work. But there's something else that's going to happen that's very, very important as well. That
It
screw
will
is going
strip
to
the screw.
it's going to strip the screw. And so whether you're trying to put the screw in or take it out, it's going to be stripped and you're going to have a much more difficult time. And I feel like this is oftentimes what happens when we use Eurocentric approaches to address Black people. So we have to be very, very mindful to center ourselves in the best of our knowledge, theories, and practices. Okay? So I want you again to think about your work as a counselor, your work as a therapist or social worker, and how this impacts you. And I want to get some feedback in just a moment. In my most recent book, Kepra, Ancient Kemetic Concepts in Education for Transformation, there's an ancient Kemetic concept, and Kemet is the original name for what we call Egypt today. But one of these concepts is called Kepra, and Kepra means being or becoming. Now think about this as it relates to those that you serve and yourself as well. Kepra means being or becoming, and it was symbolized by a scarab beetle. And the reason it was symbolized by a scarab beetle is because the ancient scientists of Kemet were very observant of nature. And one of the things that they noticed about the scarab beetle is that the scarab beetle lays its eggs in a ball of dung. Now, why would a loving mother lay its eggs in a ball of dung, waste material, right? Well, upon further analysis, they discovered that the scarab beetle lays its eggs in a ball of dung first for protection. It protects the eggs from predators. Secondly, for incubation, to keep it warm, okay? And then they noticed of all the scarab beetles that they observed in nature, the scarab beetle would always, not sometimes, not a few times, would always, each and every one, would push that ball of dung in the direct path of the sun. The sun represented light, wisdom, and illumination. The ancient Kemites didn't worship the sun, as many of us have been told. They saw the sun as a manifestation of the power of the Most High, and it represented light, wisdom, and illumination. And so the scarab beetle would push that ball of dung in the direct path of the sun. And then over time, the eggs would then hatch and rise above that ball of dung and fly away into a new reality. Now, what does that mean for us as a people? This came to be a profound symbol of transformation and transcendence. Because how many of us have been born into circumstances that were similar to this ball of dung, this ball of waste material? Or maybe you weren't born into those circumstances, but you may go through periods in your life where you experience some circumstances where you're like, how in the world did I get into this stuff? I was going to use another word, but we'll say stuff, if you understand what I mean. And so part of the counseling and therapeutic and social work practice is helping people to transcend their circumstances and be born again into new life. And this is what Kepra is all about. It's about while we're in the midst of what appears to be negative circumstances, how can we stay focused and continue to walk in the path of the sun, which represents light, wisdom, and illumination, and transcend our problems and be transformed and born again into new life. So I'd like for you to think of your work as a counselor, therapist, or social worker as helping people through this process of Kepra, being or becoming. And so it's right there that I want to stop and just get your thoughts on that. And I want you to kind of dig deeply into your practice and share with us how this might relate to your practice as a counselor, therapist, or social worker. So who's going to get us started on that? What is your aha based on these few things that I've shared so far? How does this relate to your practice? Now,
Well, I'll
for those of
go.
you all, oh, go ahead. Okay,
Um,
Olivia.
yes. Well, in my personal endeavors and like my intentionality around being a clinician, I really do think it's very powerful, especially as African Americans, to like prioritize culturally competent like viewpoints in navigating like counseling techniques that are derived from European thought. So I think it's really important for us to like create that space and just like navigate how to bridge those gaps in our unity and our healing and like bring those concepts like you spoke on to that forefront in counseling. I think that's
Wonderful.
a big priority for me.
Thank you for sharing that. Thank you for sharing that. And before the next person goes, when I look at that example of Kepler, I think about my own academic underachievement when I was in high school. At one time, I had a 1.9 GPA, and I felt like I was inside that ball of dung. I'm like, I knew I was an intelligent person. I knew that I could be so much more, but I didn't know exactly how to get out of that. But I had a dramatic intervention in my life that helped me to walk in the path of the sun, so to speak. And it helped me to rise above and transcend those circumstances and be born into new life, into the person that you see now. And I like to share that with people because when people read my bio or see that I've, written 13 books and all these different things, they make certain assumptions about me. But deep inside of this 54-year-old man is a 17-year-old boy who is self-conscious, scared, and if I'm being perfectly honest with what I know about mental health today, probably depressed as well. Um, and so I'm always mindful of that 17-year-old boy as I'm working with people now, because who you see now is very different than what I used to be. And so the reason that that concept of Kepler resonates with me is because I've been through that in several different stages of my life, not just at that time. Okay. So who else can share? What do some of these concepts mean for you and your practice? And for those of you who may not be aware, I enjoy meditating. So sometimes I'll just meditate until somebody says something before we go on to
I
the
have to
next
start
stage.
calling on some people.
Yeah. But if
So
not, oh, go ahead. Who was that?
no, that was me. I would say, just with the kind of the ball of dung, at my current placement, I'm working at a boys' home. So a lot of times they've, gone through a lot of different things that has led to them being removed from the home, and a lot of them just can't go back. And
Mhm.
so not really suitable situation for them to return to. And it kind of leaves them with feeling like discarded, these different feelings of just not being adequate, or like somebody like kind of left them. And so
Mhm.
they really aren't even aware of all the strengths that they have. And so once we kind of show them like, hey, you're great at these things, those things that you're not good at, or the things that kind of led you to being here, that's like maybe two things out of like the thousands that make up the person you are. And so once they kind of, realize those strengths, they really do like make profound changes, and they kind of like, begin to like turn their lives around.
Thank you for sharing that, Khalil. Now, do you mainly do that in group practice or in individual work with them?
It kind of depends. So I'm usually there with them as groups, but I do go for individual sessions with certain clients.
Okay, and what's the age range?
So they're usually the lowest we'll go is 14, and they age out at 18, so between 14 and 17. But we do get some kids that may be younger than 14, and we have a young man that's coming this I want to say 20. So it
Mhm.
kind of depends.
Got it, got it. Thank you for sharing that. Thank you for sharing that. Is there anybody who can share a time where you were going through a situation in your life that's similar to that ball of dung, where you're trying to figure out how did I get here and how can I get out? And maybe it led to a transformation in your life. And what did you do to facilitate that transformation? Or maybe you're in the midst of it now as you're trying to get through this program and so forth. These are some of the things that I want you all to think about. but we'll go ahead and get started on the next part. But if anybody has a question or comment, you can feel free to jump in at any time, okay? As I mentioned, my presentation is broken into several sessions, and then we stop periodically to discuss them. So session 1 is, what is Sankofa and what is Saku? You may recall my title is From Sankofa to Saku. So Sankofa, as many of you may know, is a West African Adinkra symbol, which means return and retrieve it, or go back and fetch it. Return and retrieve what? The best of your culture. Return and retrieve the best of your history and your culture. For one, because that's what all free, proud, and productive people do. But also, you can take it to another level because it has been intentionally denied us over the centuries. So it's very, very important that if we're going to find solutions to the problems that we face, one of the first things we have to do is go back and say, well, wait a minute. How did our ancestors deal with this issue? And how did our elders deal with it? To give you a quick example, in higher ed leadership, there's a lot of research on, hey, how do you meet the needs of first-generation college students? Well, we're not new to the concept of first-generation college students. We were dealing with first-generation college students coming out of emancipation, coming straight off of the plantation. How did our ancestors deal with that? How did people who had never, ever even been to school raise their children to go to school and get a college degree? Have we consulted the best as far as that's concerned? Have we gone back to prior to our enslavement and looked at how we built great universities and so forth, okay? So Sankofa is to return and retrieve it. Saku is an ancient Kemetic or Egyptian concept that Dr. Wade Nobles, a psychologist, has introduced to us. And Saku, in the ancient Kemetic language, means illumination of the spirit. Illumination of the spirit. How can I tap into those that I'm serving and help them to illuminate their spirit? This is very different from what we're oftentimes taught about what it means to be a counselor, therapist, or social worker. So he provides us with the term Sakusheti, which means one who illuminates the spirit. One who illuminates the spirit. And this is probably a little different than the definition that we've received of what it means to be a psychologist, a counselor, a therapist, or a social worker. But I want you to do your concept of who you are and what you do. You are one who illuminates the spirit. So, for example, when Khalil was talking about working with those young brothers, part of helping them to resolve past trauma is helping them to illuminate their spirit, helping them to examine not only who they are, whose they are, where they come from, and where they're going, what their talents and abilities are, what their purpose is for being on planet Earth in this particular time and space. It's about illuminating. So psychology is the study of human behavior. This is what we're taught. Psychology, which of course counselors and therapists and social workers use, psychology is the study of human behavior. But that doesn't give us access to the best approach to human behavior necessarily. Psychology comes from the Greek word psyche, and psyche was the Greek goddess of the soul. Here again, we're centered in European ideas. We have to take it back further. But psyche, the Greek term psyche, comes from the Kemetic word saku. Okay? So that's why it's important when we go back. Notice the difference again. Psychology is the study of human behavior. But saku, the sakusheti, is one who illuminates the spirit. So when we examine behavior, it's for the purpose of helping a person to be born again into their highest self. Born again into their highest self. These are some African American psychologists that I would like for you to be aware of that will help to center you into some of the things that I'm talking about. If you can, get a screenshot of this, because these are many of the psychologists and psychiatrists and counselors who can help us to recenter ourselves back to the ways of our ancestors. Okay? And if come back to that. So if you are not familiar with any of these, you definitely want to familiarize yourself with these scholars. And what you'll find when you read their work or look them up on YouTube, what you'll find is they have a very, very unique perspective and track record of helping our people to resolve a lot of the ills that we're facing. Okay? Before I go to the next slide, though, I need for you to understand that there are people who benefit economically from our lack of mental health. There are people who have a vested interest in making sure that we are psychologically, mentally and psychologically unstable. I need to say that again. In a capitalist system, which is driven by money, nothing wrong with having money, but when you place profits over people, that becomes a problem. In a society that places profits over people, we're dealing with people who have a vested interest in making sure that we are out of our minds. So you centering yourself in these therapeutic methodologies that will heal our people, you're going against the grain. There are people who don't want you to learn about these things. So you have to be mindful of that. Okay. So when we look at the definition of psychology, of Saku Sheti, the illumination of the spirit, what's your aha about that? What are your thoughts about that? I want you to dig deeply into your personal practice and what you're seeing in these different spaces where you're providing social work services or counseling and therapy. And tell me, does this concept of Seku Sheti, about being one who illuminates the spirit, are you seeing that amongst others that you're working with? The other counselors and therapists, for example, in a group home, or social workers in a group home, do you see them in those terms? Or have people just kind of settled for maybe a Band-Aid approach to just managing mental health rather than helping to grow people into their best selves? I see somebody's hand up. Unique?
I think you bring up a real astounding question, especially depending on the work that we do. But I feel like I see people in these positions where they should be helping other people find their spirit, their light, who they are. But then I see them and I'm like, I don't think you even know your light, your spirit, and who you are. And I mean that to say it's like there's a lot of people who are in these professions and they're in the profession to heal themselves, not heal the client. They're in the profession to like, oh, if I work with this population, if I work with these underserved communities, then I can go home and feel better about myself because I'm not doing anything. I'm not doing any activism. I don't want to read anything. But I work with homeless youth. I don't have to read about, white supremacy and all that because, I volunteer once a month somewhere and that's enough.
Wow.
So again, the question really comes up of how can someone illuminate a spirit if they can't even illuminate their own spirit?
Woo. Man, you preaching this morning. That's deep.
Yeah.
And that's so true. And one of the things that I've learned over the years is the only thing that I can do about that is make sure that I'm centered and on purpose myself. And so while we may observe that about other people, that's very important to observe. But the first step is to be what we're talking about for ourselves. So thank you for bringing that up. Anybody else? What are some thoughts about this, about what it means to be a Seku Sheti? And Saku meaning illumination of the spirit. Do you see this amongst your colleagues, or do you see it, the systems that you are in, more of just managing dysfunction? Or is it about illuminating the spirit and helping people to be their best selves? What are you seeing in your practice and in the places where you may be doing your internship or your practicum and different things of that nature?
So we have Jasmine and then James.
Okay.
So what I want to say is I work as a counselor, and I'm one of the only ones who actually do group therapy and actually see their clients monthly and have actual meaningful contacts. And I see a lot of my coworkers just doing it just for the money.
Wow.
And a part of me like really doesn't like that, but it's like, what can you do? But I also have a question because in my internship, in my group therapy session, they asked me, do I think medication is needed for people who are diagnosed with mental illnesses? And I really answered the question. So, just based on what you said about a capitalist country, do you feel like it's needed for all people with mental illnesses?
The short answer for me is no. I think there are a number of natural methods that can be used. I think in some circumstances, medication can be used, but I think it's something that's oftentimes overprescribed. One of the challenges that we face as a people is that we have oftentimes been misdiagnosed, mismedicated, and overmedicated.
Have mercy.
So there are people who are quick to diagnose us, even though they've misdiagnosed us, and then just push a bunch of pills on us. And you must understand, here again, in a capitalist system that's driven by profits, not by what's in the best interest of people, then what oftentimes happens is that medication is prescribed, and now you have a new problem because that medication may not be what was necessary for that person. There may have been things that could have been done from a naturopathic standpoint to help that person that don't require that medication. And then oftentimes that medication can be addictive. So I would encourage us to examine all of the possibilities in terms of what's possible as it relates to medication and to seek out some naturopathic approaches. For me, it's not either or, it's both and. There may be a time when it may be necessary for a person to be on medication. And here again, if I can just be perfectly transparent, one of my sons was in this situation. And I told him, I said, there are some natural ways that you can deal with your anxiety. And I gave him a list of things that he was not doing. And I said, if you're not going to do these things, then yeah, go ahead and take the medication. But there are some ways that you can alleviate anxiety and in some cases, depression without that. I hope that gives some insight into your question. But I just need to reiterate that oftentimes we are misdiagnosed, mismedicated, and over-medicated as a people because here again, people make multi-millions of dollars off of our ignorance and off of our lack of mental health. And they're literally banking on us being mentally ill because they make money through those drugs. So they have a vested economic interest in making sure that we remain unwell. And far too often, the medications don't heal, they manage. So I want you to just kind of be mindful of that as you move forward in your practice. So thank you for that question. I think James was next.
Similarly, my experience relates to the conversation that we were just having. Last year, my internship, I was going into sessions thinking about how I could look for symptomology, to tie it to the DSM, to figure out a modality to use to help the client. Within this last and final year of my placement, a clinician at my site has more of a spiritual approach, and I've been adapting to his methods because he says he goes into it not asking or thinking, what's wrong with you, but he said to himself, he thinks, what happened to you instead, and moves through his process of individual and group therapy services, taking into account the experiences of the person as a Black man or a Black woman or a Black trans-identified individual, but the experience of the person weighs more on him as far as how he moves in treatment versus solely relying on the DSM and making a diagnosis, as now in a lot of clinical settings, you have to have a diagnosis to get paid. And essentially those things might not be conducive to the life that the clients live. So his approach has definitely been beneficial for me, not negating the DSM, but not being so heavily reliant on what it tells us the client has, because it doesn't necessarily take into account the lived experience.
Yes, I'm so glad that you mentioned that. So Malcolm X said, of all of our studies, history is best qualified to reward all research. So let's look into the history of the DSM. We were not at the table when that was being written. Now that we're at what, DSM-5, yeah, I'm sure there's some Black people who have contributed here and there to that. But generally speaking, this is a group of people who have colonized the world, who have come together to put together a diagnostic and statistical manual to diagnose mental health without addressing their own mental health. Oh, you follow what I'm saying? Can I be real this morning? I mean, we're here, so let's be real. We're dealing with people who lacked balanced mental health, who have colonized the world, who said, okay, we're going to put together a diagnostic and statistical manual to diagnose mental health that we haven't dealt with in ourselves. Take it a step further, and here's an organization that I want you all to be aware of, ABPSI, the Association of Black Psychologists. In the late 1960s, if you're not already aware of it, in the late 1960s, Black psychologists like Naeem Akbar, Saeed Khatib, Wade Nobles, and so forth, they recognized as they were coming through graduate school that their preparation as psychologists was not equipping them to help their own people. And they recognized the contradictions in the European approach. So they said, we don't want to be a part of the American Psychological Association because it is deeply flawed and racist. And so they, instead of trying to present at those conferences and things, they established the Association of Black Psychologists and developed a completely unique approach to working with our people. I'm simply sharing that to say to you that there's a whole different set of diagnoses that you will not find in the DSM-5. The Diagnostic and Statistical Manual that they've put together does not include some of the things. So I'm glad that you were already operating as a Sekou Shetty and listening to your own spirit saying, hey, there's something that's not here. And I want you all, everybody that's on this call, I want to encourage you all to be the ones that develop the therapeutic approaches and the theories, so that when another student is coming through this program 5, 10, 15, 20 years from now, that your theory and your therapeutic approach will be a part of the curriculum. I want you to see yourself like that. I want you to see yourself as an innovative clinician and practitioner, so much so that new theories and therapeutic approaches will be birthed through you because of your higher consciousness and your willingness to go deep within yourself and to interrogate what's going on with the people that you're working with. Is this making sense? So we fully, I always say this to my students as well, because when they're working on their dissertations, they have to choose a theory. And if they want me to be on their dissertation committee, I'm saying, I need you to first choose a Black theory. Not just because it's Black, but because it works. But secondly, several years from now, you need to develop your own theory. A theory that we can study 5, 10, 20 years from now, okay? And this is what it's going to require for us, because one of the things that I often say is that there are no white solutions to Black problems. I need to say that again. I don't know if they heard me, Dr. Giddings.
I did.
We got some deep problems, y'all. And there are no white solutions to Black problems. How can you look to the one who caused most of our problems to then solve our problems? So we have to be the ones, as the scholars, as the leaders, as the practitioners, as the psychologists, the counselors, the therapists, and social workers, to come up with our own modalities. This is so important. And many have, but oftentimes they don't make it into the quote unquote mainstream curriculum. The mainstream has become the pain stream. Right? All right. Anybody else who wants to talk about any of these concepts?
Aisha Clark.
Go ahead.
Asha, but
Asha.
I forgot my point. It was something about capitalism and having to diagnose people on the first go, but it's been so long, I can't
I'm
remember the
sorry.
finer points.
I'm sorry about that.
No, it's okay. Y'all were saying good stuff.
Okay.
Thank you.
Was there anybody else before we
I
move
don't
to
see
the next
anybody
one?
else.
All right. This next part that I want to share with you has nothing to do with, well, maybe there is some psychology in it, but we'll see. But it's not necessarily meant to be instructive per se. It's just a quick survey that I have, because when I was born and raised in the Midwest in Toledo, Ohio. When I moved south, there were some things that were very different from what I was used to. And so I just want to see what this means to you. And I didn't realize how controversial it was till I got to the South. So my question to you is, if I gave you a bowl of grits, are you putting sugar or salt in those grits, if you eat grits? You can put your message in the chat box. I see sugar. Asha says sugar. Jacqueline says salt. Kiana says sugar every time. Okay. Crystal says salt. Kiana says salt. Joy says salt. Shamika says sugar. Whoever's on the iPhone says sugar. Man, looks like we got a mixture here. Khalil, salt. Sugar, Jasmine, salt. Olivia. I think we have a few more. Unique says whatever I'm craving in the moment. Okay. It seems like we have a few more salts than sugar. Okay. If you put salt in the chat box, if you were born in the South and you put salt, I want you to put yes in the chat box. If you're born in the South and you put salt, put yes in the chat box. Okay. I'm seeing a lot of yeses. Wow. Okay. If you were born and raised in the North or the Midwest and you put sugar, would you now put yes in the chat box? Okay. Interesting. Okay. So yeah, I'll never forget, Dr. Giddings, when I moved south, I was out somewhere and I got some grits and I went to put some sugar in my grits and people looked at me like I had lost it was like a sin. They looked at me like I had lost my mind. Like, what are you doing?
Oh.
And I had no idea. I didn't know it was such a big deal. I thought everybody did that. And the way that I explain this is that growing up in the North during the winters, a lot of times we would have cream of wheat or grits or oatmeal for breakfast, and we just used to put sugar in it. I had never heard of putting salt on grits, but now I can do them either way. Okay.
Interesting.
Kishana says sugar be good and mix some eggs in there. Yeah, I feel you on that. Yep. I was an adult when I found out people I had sugar on grits. Yep, it's like that. Okay. All right. My next question for you. Give me just a second as I pull it up. I'm just getting to know you a little bit. Let's see. If you happen to eat chicken, for you, is it flats or drums, or does it matter to you? What's your preference, flats or drums? Just drop it in the chat box. Flats all day, says Krista. Okay, drums, Kamarian. People are very passionate about these answers, Dr. Giddings. Let's see, flats, no preference, flats. Wow, flats have taken the day. Few people said it doesn't matter. But here again, I didn't know this was a thing. Like in the South, when I was growing up, you didn't have a choice. You look, first of all, we had the whole wing, Dr. Giddings. But in the few times, when they were separated, you just took what you got. I didn't know you can go to restaurants now and order a whole plate of just flats. That blew my mind. Just crumbs and so forth. Wow. Now, again, this has nothing to do with the topic. I'm just getting to know you a little bit. But I'm sure there is a psychology behind that somewhere. All right. Just something to think about. Okay. So as we go to the next stage of our unfolding here this morning, we're going to go into session 2. And session 2 asks the question, what is African-centered education, counseling, and therapy? Okay. Now, I use the terms Afrocentric and African-centered interchangeably, just so that you know. I use those terms interchangeably. Not all scholars do, but I do. African-centered or Afrocentric, I use it interchangeably. So what is African-centered education, counseling, and therapy? Okay. One of the challenges that I faced as a scholar was there were these really long definitions of Afrocentric or African-centered education. I mean, literally definitions would be anywhere from a paragraph to a page. So the scholar in me said, we have to shorten this because it's too long and people already have a lot of misconceptions about what it is. So one of my goals was to shorten the definition to help people understand it a little bit better. So my definition of Afrocentric or African-centered counseling and therapy is centering ourselves and our students or clients in the best of African culture. We need to center ourselves first as the counselor, therapist, or social worker, because we can't expect for them to be centered until we first are. So centering ourselves and our clients in the best of our culture to do 3 things: to examine and analyze information, to meet needs, and solve problems in Black communities. So we need to break this down piece by piece. Okay, so first we want to center ourselves before we can expect anybody else to be centered. Before I come into this space with you, I have to meditate and pray and center myself first. So we want to center ourselves and then our clients in the best of our culture. At a time when most of our people have not been exposed to the best of our culture, they've been exposed to the worst of our culture. And then, watch this, Dr. Giddings, not only being exposed to the worst of the culture, they begin to associate every negative thing with being Black. They begin to associate ignorance, violence, criminality, failure with being Black, rather than associating excellence and achievement with being Black. So we want to center ourselves and our clients in the best of African culture, and then use that as a lens to examine and analyze information, meet needs, and solve problems in Black communities. Let me go back for a second. Examine and analyze information. If we don't understand the challenges that we face as a people, if we're not understanding it in the context of who we are as a people, we're going to miss the mark. We have experienced intergenerational, multi-generational, unaddressed trauma. Let me explain that again. We've experienced intergenerational, from generation to generation, multi-generational, a number of generations, unaddressed trauma. And we have been 400 years without therapy as a people. What white folk oftentimes considered insane was actually sane behavior on the part of Black people. I'm gonna get to that in a little bit. And what they considered sane was actually insane. I'm gonna break down what I mean by that in just a little bit. So bear with me. So we center ourselves and our clients in the best of African culture to examine and analyze information, meet needs, and solve problems in Black communities. One of the challenges that we face is that most of us have been trained and educated to meet needs and solve problems, not for Black communities, but for other communities. Thank goodness here at CAU, we're training you to go out and meet needs and solve problems in our communities and to be able to function in all communities, but to meet needs and solve problems specifically in our communities. But most people have been trained to meet needs and solve problems for other people, and their value in this society is determined by their ability to solve problems for other people rather than their own. Okay? So this is why African-centered or Afrocentric education, counseling, and therapy is so very, very important for us. Okay? So there's some key terms that I want you to be mindful of in this segment. And those terms are centered, decentered, and recentered. Okay? Now take a look at this diagram. Here we have a circle with a dot in the middle. The circle represents your family and your community. The circle represents your family and the community. The dot represents you. One more time, the circle represents your family and your community, and the dot represents you. Notice that the dot is in the center, okay? And I want you to look at what happens when we are centered as a people. Look at what begins to emerge in our families and communities. All of these wonderful things happen. We have power, we have unity, we have economic empowerment, we have faith, love, joy, creativity, productivity, safety, security. All of these things are available to us when we are centered. Centered in what? Centered in the best of our culture. Okay? But if you look over to the left-hand side of your screen, you will see a magnet. And there are forces and factors in society that act like this magnet that attempt, watch very carefully, that pull us from our place of power. And now look at what emerges in our families, in our communities, and in our individual lives. Look at what emerges. Before we were centered, now we've been decentered. And look at what begins to emerge in our families and communities when we become decentered. Wow. Violence, academic failure, unemployment, underemployment, behavior and problems, destruction, apathy. All because we have been decentered. So if we've been decentered, when I come to your group, when I come to my session with you, my counseling session with you, when I'm in your group home, wherever you're providing services, it should be a recentering experience for me because I've been decentered. And if we've been decentered, we must be recentered as a people. This is so critically important because oftentimes when we come in contact with those that we're working with, they're going to be in a decentered state. They're going to be removed from their place of power. And part of our purpose as the clinician, as the counselor, as the therapist, as the social worker, is to help to recenter them in the best possibilities for who they are. Okay? However, here's something that I've noticed over the years. I want you to imagine for just a moment that the center is way over to the right-hand side. You see the half circle. And let's imagine imagine that the center is in the center of that half circle. We have people who don't know anything about what it means to be centered. Why? Because they were born into decentered circumstances. They don't know anything about their authentic place of power. They don't know anything about their authentic culture. They don't know about their personal power. They were born into decentered circumstances, and look at what happens in their life. They're just going in circles, experiencing all of these different things: academic failure, unemployment, underemployment, media manipulation, teen pregnancy, behavior problems, poverty, deception, debt, destruction, violence, disrespect, police brutality, depression, anxiety, broken families, child molestations, going in circles, who don't even know that they have a place of power. For me, if I've been decentered, I can say, oh, I need to get back to my centering practices like prayer and meditation and exercise. But what about the person who doesn't even know that there is a center, that doesn't know that they have this personal power, and that we as a people have a collective power? So part of our purpose is to help recenter our people in the best of our history and culture. Now, I want you to examine, what does that mean for your practice, for what you're seeing in your life, in your practice, in your internship, practicum, observations, or classes. I want you to tell me your thoughts on this concept of being centered. What centers you? Let's start with that. Let's start with that specific question. What centers you? What help, and by centered, I mean, what helps you to be at your best?
Cassius had his hands up.
Okay, go ahead, Cassius.
Well, I would say for me, what really centers me is just my family, my friends, and most recently, I guess in this phase of my life, I'll say my cohort, people who are kind of like can relate to what I'm going through and have a different, viewpoint of life, I guess, in that moment. So I would say just my close people, just being around them, being in that element, getting their energy is what centers me, and just love is really what centers me.
Wonderful, wonderful. Okay. Unique, go ahead.
I'd say my journey centers me. You
How so?
know, as somebody who was told their whole life they weren't going to get a master's degree, as someone who was told their whole life that they couldn't pursue an education, who came from being homeless, who came from, just a family who didn't support education. So what centers me is when I finally have those time to just relax, I think about all the obstacles that came in my way and how I still made it to where I was supposed to be.
So let me ask you this. That's a really good point. Um, so Unique, how were you able to turn the traumas that you experienced in the past into triumph? Because there's some people who've been through the same things that you just talked about, but they would have a very different, disempowering perspective, whereas you've taken that pain and turned it into power. Can you talk a little bit about that for a second?
I don't know. I think just like for anybody, you have to have that mindset of you have to just keep going because at some point it's going to work. Because to me, I didn't even know I wanted to be a counselor, but I knew I was going to go to school. I knew I needed education to survive in the world. I knew the right things to get where I was supposed to go, and I felt like the journey, the story, and the purpose just came with it. But I think, like you said, the problem is people, because they don't have that purpose yet, they don't have the promise yet, they stop or they like get, or they let something drag them down. But the reality for me, it was like the only thing that could stop me kind of is me at this point.
Okay. Thank you for sharing that. I appreciate that. Okay. Who else can share? What centers you? Mercy.
I kind of have a question. So, when looking at your slide, one of the points on there was child molestation, and I was kind of wondering how being decentered from a community like leads to child molestation, or like what your thoughts about that are. Because at my internship, I work with kids who experience like child sexual abuse, sex trafficking, commercial exploitation. And I'm kind of interested in knowing like how not being centered um
I'm glad you asked that.
brings that into life and causes that.
Right. I'm glad you asked that. The intent of putting that on the screen was having, for someone who's had that experience, it can lead them to being decentered. So yeah, just a slight difference in it. So I hope you understand that. Okay. So thank you for that question for clarification. I'm glad you asked because I wouldn't want that to be misinterpreted. Okay.
Crystal, did you want to expound on what you put in the chat? I think it's so valuable if you would share that with us.
Mhm.
Sure. Good morning. So yeah, like I came to the United States at age 18. So, you know, a lot of people in my family, you know, we're not big of education. So my grandmother had a dozen kids, 6 boys, 6 girls. And the offsprings, you know, there's not a lot of people that believe in college. There's not a lot of people that believe in mental health. So I've always had to find my own way and find things that intrigued me and things that I wanted to be grounded in my own space and how I can excel in my life and in my future and in my endeavors. So just being in that space, I had a lot of naysayers, like people in my family who are just like, oh, you're just trying to be better than us, or you're just trying to do this, or you're trying to do that. And I really wasn't. I was just trying to do something that I was passionate about and try to beat the odds of not being a part of the entire statistics in my family of becoming an alcoholic or having 5, 6 kids, you know, just not, I just didn't want to be that person. So they looked at me differently and thought I was trying to, you know, stand out and not be a part of the family. So I really don't talk to a lot of my family because we don't see eye to eye on that. But you know, I'm proud of where I am. I'm proud of where I've gotten to because it took a lot of work. I've been through a lot of stuff in my life, and a lot of therapy and a lot of grounding have gotten me to where I am right now to not think about a naysayer. So I'm very happy to where I am right now, and I'm happy to be in this milestone and this era that I'm in now. Yeah.
Thank you for
Thank you
sharing that,
so
Crystal.
much.
Thank
And I
you.
need to ask you the same question that I asked Unique, and that is, how did you make that shift when a lot of people who have gone through similar circumstances would have been dragged down by those very same things? And before you answer that, Jasmine and Cassius, I want you to remember what your question or comment is. I don't want to lose you, but I definitely want Crystal to unpack that for a second.
So I think my mom, like growing up with a single mom who worked 3 jobs to ensure that you had everything that you needed and didn't spoil me, but make sure I understood the value of hard work. That like she is my ideal role model. Like I don't think I could ever look up to anybody as well as I look up to my mom because she has always taught me and my sister. My sister and I are 8 years apart. She's 8 years older than me, but she's always been structured on I couldn't get the tools to get the education that I needed. My mom didn't go past high school and she almost didn't make it through high school, but she made sure she set us up for success and she was not standing for anything less. So because of that, I knew I had high expectations that I had to meet and there was no other option. So even though we may stray and we may be like, oh, I'm not really interested, she made sure that she pulled us back on task because she's like, I was not able to do this. I'm working for you and I want you to make something of yourself so that you can go out into the world and do something for the community, do something for your offsprings and instill the same values into them as I did to you. So all of this started from my mom. So I give all kudos to her for everything that she's done for me and continues to do for me on a daily basis.
Powerful. Thank you so much for sharing.
Thank you. Thank you so
Okay.
much.
Cassius.
Yeah, so it's pretty much just a statement from that question you just asked and start. I wasn't thinking when you actually need the question. Um, Pretty much, I look at everyone has a story and everyone has picture things. And for myself, I asked, how did I get here? And what kept me pushing through my story and trials and tribulations. And it's really just this phrase that just stuck in my head. I don't know where it came from. It was more so of, I've already made it through the worst day of my life. And so when I'm going through things and, been through some pretty strenuous situations, being homeless and, raising children at a young age with no support and no guidance, but actually making it, and I look back now as an adult and, I feel it's in a successful place in my life. How did I get here? It was just that mindset of I've already made it through the worst day of my life. So, I can do this too. And I guess it's more so just looking for inspiration, not necessarily motivation. I don't believe that you can be motivated from outside sources, being that the base word of motivation is motive. And that is something that comes from within. So it's just looking for inspiration. And I guess I get inspired. I don't know if it sounds crazy or I don't know how it sounds or if I'm saying it
Sounds
right, but it's
good.
just
Yeah, it doesn't
I've
sound
already,
crazy at all. I don't know
yeah,
how it hit other people, but it hit different for me. When you said I've already been through the worst days, that's a huge psychological edge. Like, okay, whatever this is that I'm dealing with now, hey, I've already been through the worst of it. I can take this. So
so
I
that was just the
appreciate you
answer
sharing
to the
that.
question. No problem.
So that's definitely a centering affirmation. And that's something that we should all have, a centering mantra or affirmation or set of affirmations that helps to get us centered so that we can be our best selves for ourselves and for those that we're serving. So thank you so much for that. Jasmine, did you still have something that you wanted to share as well?
Yes, I think I just really wanted to talk about the phenomenology of what is normal and not normal,
Mm,
because we all have our own definitions of what we feel like is normal. And it may be abnormal for others. So, like you said, you grew up putting sugar on your grits versus someone from the South, they think that's the craziest thing they ever heard. Like, that's not normal for someone who grew up in the South. And so I think when it comes to uh, our clients and in being within that circle, they may not know that they were born outside of that circle because that was normal for them.
mm,
And just, I think just knowing, or even when they come to the realization that they didn't grow up in that circle or don't have the ability to be a part of a circle just due to, like, trauma, past trauma, or the fact that the lack of knowledge of how to get into a circle when they've been out of it for so long. So I just wanted to say that.
Awesome.
thank you so much for sharing that because I think there's a whole range of thoughts and behaviors that have been normalized. They're not normal, but they've been normalized in our community. Poverty is not necessarily normal, it's been normalized in our community.
Yes.
Academic underachievement is not normal, but it's been normalized in our community. Violence between males and females is not normal,
Mm-hmm.
but it's been normalized
Yes.
in our community. So it's very, very important. And here again, this is why it's so important to be centered in the best of our culture, because if you're not centered in the best of our culture, you will assume that some things are normal that really are not. And that leads perfectly into our next segment. So I really appreciate you sharing that with us. The next session is, what is culture? I've been throwing this word culture around for some time, but it requires a definition. And uh, I think for me, Wade Nobles has one of the best definitions of culture. He says, culture provides a general design for living and patterns for interpreting reality. This is so significant to me because when he says a general design for living, the general design for living that I grew up under, that was normalized for me, but I think for a lot of other Black folk, the general design for living was faith in God, hard work, and education. Faith in God, hard work, and education. That regardless of what we were experiencing as a people, it was believed that these three things, generally speaking, could help us to live a fuller and more fulfilled life. So the general design for living was faith in God, hard work, generally speaking, and education. Then culture also provides patterns for interpreting reality. And to give you an idea, that means as I look at your wonderful faces on the screen, I see brothers and sisters. Other people might look at the faces on the screen and see N words and B words. Now, this is a whole other conversation about how we've become decentered in our language. The fact that as a people, we used to see ourselves as brothers and sisters, but now through skillful media manipulation and decenteredness, now we see ourselves as niggas and bitches. That's deeply problematic. But culture provides patterns for interpreting reality. So when you've been decentered and dislocated from the best of your culture, then your patterns for interpreting reality become distorted. Again, when you've been decentered from the best of your culture, your patterns for interpreting reality become distorted. Dr. Nobles goes on to tell us that culture is the electricity that illuminates the light bulb. It's like the electricity that illuminates the light bulb. The light bulb is not very helpful without that carbon filament on the inside that keeps it lit. Quick Black History Minute. It was a Black man who developed the carbon filament that allowed the light bulb to stay lit. So when Edison invented the light bulb, he had a problem. He could light it, but he couldn't help it to stay lit. It was Lewis Latimer, a Black inventor, who developed the carbon filament on the inside that allowed it to stay lit. So culture is like the electricity that illuminates the light bulb. And then he says culture is to humans as water is to fish. And so for so many of our brothers and sisters, they're operating in families, in communities, in schools, in group homes, like a fish out of water, because they've been disconnected and dislocated from the best of the culture. Dr. Marimba Ani tells us culture is ordered behavior. It doesn't take very long to see that there's some things that are out of order in our families and in our communities. And this goes back to what was said earlier about what has been normalized in our communities, what has been normalized. She says your culture is your immune system. What a rich metaphor, especially having come through the COVID-19 pandemic, where people's immune systems were compromised. Your culture is your immune system. And when your immune system is compromised, you become vulnerable to viruses. So there are viruses of violence in our community. There are viruses of miseducation and undereducation. There are viruses of poverty, viruses of mental instability, and so many other things, of abuse. Your culture is your immune system. Now, that leads to this piece right here. I love what Resma Menakem says. This is key. So you might want to get a shot of this particular screen image. Trauma in a people over time can look like culture. Trauma in a people over time can look like culture. Unaddressed trauma in people over time can look like culture. So there's some people who say, oh, academic underachievement, oh, that's just a part of their culture. No, it's not. That's unaddressed trauma in a people looking like culture. Oh, violence and criminality, that's a part of their culture. No, it's not. That's unaddressed trauma in a people looking like culture. Apathy, lack of determination, run down neighborhoods, mass incarceration. Oh, that's just a part of their culture. No, it's not. That is unaddressed trauma in a people over time looking like culture. Calling ourselves niggas and bitches. This is a research question, Dr. Giddings. I posed this to my research methods class. This is a researchable topic. At what time did we start referring to ourselves as niggas and bitches in our music and so-called entertainment? That's a researchable question. And it is not normal. It's not, it has been normalized, but it's not normal to take the words that your oppressor injected and imposed upon you and to then refer to yourselves as that. That is unaddressed trauma in a people over time looking like culture. And some of us have embraced it and tried to flip it and make it into something positive. But what I've discovered over the years is there's really no good way to be a nigga. And there's really no good way to be a bitch.
Wow. Amazing.
Just something to think about. That's just my perspective. But unaddressed trauma in a people over time can look like culture. So we have to understand what culture really is. Now, you remember earlier I said that Europeans defined certain behaviors as sane that was really insane. And then they diagnosed certain things that were insane as sane. Let me give you an example, okay? Here is a mental health diagnosis, and it's called drapetomania. Now, if you've heard of mania before, would you put yes in the chat box really quick? If you're familiar with drapetomania, would you please put a yes in the chat box? If you haven't heard of it, put a no. I don't see any yeses, and I don't know if that's okay. I see a couple of people. One person said yes, but we got a lot of no's. Okay, so all right, so we need to find out what drapetomania is. Drapetomania was a psychological condition, and this psychological condition was it was developed as a psychological condition by a man by the name of Samuel Cartwright. Remember what Malcolm said, of all of our studies, history is best qualified to reward all research. All right. So drapetomania was written about in a paper called Diseases and Peculiarities of the Negro Race by Samuel Cartwright in 1851. What's the historical context in 1851? We are still enslaved as a people. So bear that in mind, okay? And here are the characteristics of drapetomania. It's a mental illness that caused enslaved Africans to run away. We're talking about the very foundations of European psychology, where they have diagnosed something that is sane, they diagnose it as insane. They say if you are an enslaved African and trying to run away, that's a mental illness. And we call it drapetomania. He presented this to the Medical Association of Louisiana. In addition to that, whenever scholars develop a theory or a concept, they then have to develop recommendations. And here's what he recommended, with quote unquote whipping the devil out of them as a preventive measure. This is psychology. Removal of both big toes to prevent running away. This is just one example of misdiagnosis and mistreatment. So there have been things that were diagnosed as sane that were really insane, and things that are insane that have been diagnosed as sane. For example, going along to get along and what's the word I'm looking for? Assimilating into the madness of Eurocentric society is oftentimes seen as sane. So this is why it's so important that we have our unique perspective and allow our culture to speak to what we're experiencing. Otherwise, as Baba Tashango and Billy Shaka says, African people without their culture relate to one another through their trauma. African people without their culture relate to one another through their trauma, and these trauma bonds can be very destructive if we're not careful. So there are particular values that we have that are at variance with the society that we're in. Our values are communal, cooperative, and collective, okay? But the traditional Eurocentric values are competitive, individualistic, and contentious. We're communal, cooperative, and collective. But there's a time when if more than 2 or 3 of us were gathered together, it was seen as illegal. Isn't that interesting? Because it says in the scriptures, wherever 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, there I am in the midst of them. But we live in a society that would not allow us to gather together. Something to think about. So our values are at variance with, oftentimes, with the larger values of America. So does culture matter? Well, let's see. On the one hand, we're African. On the other hand, we're American. Look at, there's a little bit of overlap there. Okay. Here's the ways in which we're African is based on our DNA and cultural affiliation. We're American by citizenship and geographical location. But look at what's happening to us, and I want you to evaluate this as a clinician, as a psychologist, as a counselor, as a social worker, because we're African American, but look at what's happening. There is the attempt to erase and wipe out our culture. What are the psychological effects of that? What are the psychological effects of the young brothers that you work with who know that they're being constantly under surveillance by the police? Who know that they're seen as a threat constantly? I had a friend of mine that I used to train with in the martial arts, and he's a former athlete. He played in the NFL and was one of the top players in college and so forth. 6'3", 340 pounds, big brother, dark-skinned brother. And he confided in me one time. He said, man, whenever I'm around white folks, one of the first things that I have to do is make them laugh. I said, what the hell? What kind? Now I understand why he's saying that, because he has to put them at ease because they are automatically afraid of him. But I'm saying, what kind of psychology? You got to walk around carrying the weight of that. Like I'm some kind of damn comedian. I got to make people laugh all the time just to feel comfortable in my presence because they can't handle my blackness or the bigness of my blackness. Think about that for a second. What type of what type of impact does that have? And then bear this in mind. James Baldwin said, to be African American is to be African without memory and American without privilege. To be African without memory and American without privilege. What are the psychological implications and effects of that? And so we look, some of the other psychological effects, the gangsterization and criminalization of young Black males, and the hypersexualization, the adultification of Black females. What impact does that have on their psychological well-being? The fact that you have young girls that are looked at as objects of sexual pleasure rather than subjects worthy of dignity and respect, and as a result of that, may have experienced sexual violence. In addition to that, are being strategically coerced into sexual activity on social media to make money. So you have teachers that will tell you that their female students are wanting to be, you know, the video vixens of Instagram because that's how they can make money. So they're being taken through a process of hypersexualization. All of these things have a psychological impact on our people, and that psychology impacts their behavior. And you and I, as the counselor, as the therapist, as a social worker, have to be aware of these dynamics. What's your aha? In this section, we gave a definition of culture. Culture as ordered behavior, according to Dr. Marimba Ani. Culture from Dr. Wade Nobles as patterns for interpreting reality and so forth. But what's your aha on these things that I've shared? Talked about unaddressed trauma and people looking like culture. How does this relate to your practice and what you're seeing?
Asha has her hand up.
Asha, you had it right.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Earlier you had a slide that said, what was it? Culture is to people as water is to fish. And I thought of it as something that influences us, but we don't really acknowledge it. Like, I feel like we as Black people are very aware of our culture because we have to be, because bits and pieces of it are always being taken from us. But on a whole, people don't acknowledge the little things that influence their lives. And they don't recognize it when it happens. They're just like, why is this happening? How could this happen to me? But they don't see that the things that were predetermined before they were born have already affected their life before they even had a chance to know what it was.
Mm. Wow.
Mhm.
So I want to add something to what you just said. Just that, people aren't really considering the culture. But what's funny is the things that enter into our vocabulary. And what I hear a lot of people saying these days, hey, do it for the culture, do it for the culture. You hear people saying that. But the things that they're pushing are not best for the culture, right? So just something to think about as it relates to what you shared. And that's one of the reasons why I wanted to provide a definition of culture that I thought would be helpful for us, okay? So thank you for sharing that, Asha. Let's see, Cassius, what are your thoughts?
So on that slide that you had, I took a screenshot. Trauma in a people over time can look like culture. And then you spoke about how I guess now we use the word, the B in the N word, right? And we've been called that so much and being called that so much to we kind of like adopted it. Would you say that we adopted it to like combat what it means from their point of view, and to not necessarily, like you said, it's not a good word. Those aren't good words in general, but it's more so of, hey, the way that we use it now. I know, or I'm that N or I'm that B, and it can be looked at as like, highlighted, and to feel like you're something positive, and they can't use this against me. I'm going to use it and turn it into a positive viewpoint, even though those words, by definition, is nowhere near positive. You get what I'm saying? So is that
Yeah.
like, like that's trauma, of course, but is that us trying to combat trauma?
Yeah, so I've certainly seen some people, try to flip it and um, and make an argument that it can be used in a positive way. You'd be amazed at some of the conversations I've had over the years with some of my students uh, who try to make it sound like a good thing. In my personal opinion, um, I think those arguments lack an understanding of the deep psychological trauma um, that comes from what we've experienced as a people. Um, and so the times that you'll hear me using those words is when I'm typically teaching us that we should not.
Right.
But I do recognize that there's some that have tried to flip it and use it in a positive way. I appreciate you sharing that.
Right. And I had one more thing when it came to culture. Um, I know when I think of culture, just on a regular basis, we say culture, the first thing that comes in my mind is Black people, you know. But then I also, coming from a small town in Alabama where racism was like at a high level, I think about like a white person's culture. You're like in my hometown, you're kind of like they were like taught in they grew up like racism is okay, racism is real, like that's all they've known, and that's what I'm like, okay, so that's their culture, that's what's been pushed on them. And of course you can educate yourself, and learn a little bit more, but it I don't know if I'm like, I don't want to say I don't know how to want to word this. I don't want to blame them. I want to educate you. And then if you're educated, or if I gave you the information and you still choose not to believe it, then do I blame them? But then it's like, hey, how can I expect them to believe me or what I'm saying, or even, want to investigate this themselves based on what I've told them, when they've been taught that, hey, this person is pretty much wrong, or bad for you, or you're superior to them, so they wouldn't even take what I'm saying as that serious. So do I blame them because you're in your culture, you're raised like, hey, you're superior, like this is what you've known your whole life. Am I making sense?
You say, should we blame white people? Is that what you're saying?
In a sense, yeah, like
Okay.
right. The one right.
Okay.
When you're raised up in a culture where everything around you is telling you like, hey, you're superior, racism is okay, blase, blase, your father was this, your grandfather was this. Essentially the same thing that we've been told on the opposite side of, history and how it's been put to us is like, hey, you are people of, you're descendants of kings and queens, that I think that kind of helps mold our culture to get us to want to get back to that. You know what I mean?
Okay. So let me say this. Afrocentricity doesn't dwell on oppression, for one thing. It has a perspective on oppression, and certainly we're discussing some of those things today. But Afrocentricity is a quest for agency, power, and self-determination. It doesn't dwell on oppression. If talking to white folks or trying to address their culture, for me, it's not about placing blame. It's about sharing realities that they may be unaware of. And so while I feel blessed to share this space with you all today, you might be surprised to know that I do a lot of work in amongst various cultures, particularly in my efforts to get to Black children. I have to go through white people sometimes because oftentimes in a lot of school districts, the educators and administrators don't look like the children that they're serving. So I work with a lot of very diverse leaders and teachers and counselors who are white. And so I have to very delicately peel back the layers of some of these types of things. So it's not about blame, it's about sharing information about themselves that they may not have been aware of. Just like you said, because they were raised in it. Let me say it like this. The motivational speaker, Les Brown, says, you can't see the picture when you're in the frame. Let me say that again. You can't see the picture when you're in the frame. So a lot of things that white folk do subconsciously that they're not aware of. Now, there are some things that they do that they're very aware of. Okay, let me be clear about that. But there are some unconscious things as well. So it's not about playing the blame game. It's about sharing information that, just like you would in a therapeutic setting, it's about sharing information that helps a person to gain another perspective or viewpoint on themselves. And I think that's the best that we can expect. When you talk about unconditional positive regard, when I go into a space, as you can probably tell from what I've shared today, I have very particular thoughts and feelings about white supremacy ideology and what that and white folk have done to Black people and people of color. I have very particular and very obviously strong feelings about that. When I go into a space to teach and to share, I have to recenter myself and see everybody in front of me as spiritual beings who have a choice to make based on the information that I'm going to share. And I'm going to bring my best self and I'm going to present this information, and hopefully they will be able to make better choices and practices based on what's shared. So I hope that answers your question. It's not about the blame game, not about blame, but there are reasons for things. Does
Right.
that answer?
Yeah, that helps me out a lot.
Okay, thank you so much. All right, Mercy.
So when you were talking about your friend in martial arts who wanted to make people laugh because he wanted to make him comfortable, make white people comfortable with him, that really resonated with me. So me and my brothers are adopted and we were like raised in the white area. And so I think for me, I realized I was doing that, like making myself smaller, making my blackness smaller to make other people feel comfortable. And I think around 8th grade, I realized it was starting to piss me off and really annoy me. So I just um did did things to make white people uncomfortable on purpose, kind of out of rebellion to kind of show like, no, I am who I am. Like I don't have to be fit in these boxes. So like I went natural. specifically because of Lupita Nyong'o, but I went natural. I didn't participate in like the stereotypical Black things that they were putting onto me and that they expected me to do. Um, and it also resonated with me because I see my brothers and one of my uncles who's adopted in my family, like trying to be this palatable Blackness to non-Black people to try to fit into what their version of Blackness is. And it drives their behaviors. And I've been trying to show them like, hey, you feel this way because you're trying to fit into this small box of Blackness. Like what they're trying to put you into, that's not what you have to be. Blackness can be expressed in any way you want because you are Black. So, yeah, it's been interesting to see my brothers and my uncle like mm, not struggle in life and kind of not want to, how do I say this nicely? Not want to be Black, if that makes sense, and wanting to fit into a type of Blackness that white people put on them. And I think what was said in my grandmother's hands about like culture, like unresolved trauma becomes culture. I think that culture that a lot of white people think that we are is just unresolved trauma. And I see that in people who don't want, how do I say this? I see people struggling to fit into that type of Blackness because it's not their true authentic selves. I just thought that was really interesting.
Really appreciate you sharing that. So let me say this. Trying to fit into other people's ideas of Blackness is a maladaptive behavior. Okay. In addition to that, it's exhausting and it's not good for our mental health. The flip side of that is when you come into an awareness and you say, okay, I'm gonna do stuff to intentionally piss white people off or other people off because of their erroneous thoughts about Black people. That's exhausting as well. Neither of those represent our authentic identity. What we want to do is relieve ourselves of all that energy that it takes to do all those different things and just be ourselves, our authentic selves. And I'm not suggesting that that's something that can happen overnight. First, it starts with awareness. And we have to recognize that, particularly for those brothers, and I'm sure this is true for sisters in some ways as well, brothers are seen as an immediate threat. And so that maladaptive behavior, if we unpack that psychologically, is for the purpose of mere survival. Like if he gets pulled over by the police, there's like a survival instinct that has to kick in. And so for many of our people over time, it's to the point where it's become epigenetic. It transfers from generation to generation where we have adapted and adopted certain behaviors to make white folk feel comfortable in our presence. But that doesn't serve our quest for liberation or to be fully human. And so I want to say this, I hope it's understood. I'm going to say it the best way that I can. I would like to encourage each of you to structure your life so that you are not under the economic or intellectual authority of non-Black people. Because my own experience and what I've observed and those that I work with, and I work with a lot of Black people who are in culturally isolated spaces, schools, colleges, and universities. I'm called upon to speak to those groups. I'm thankful that I was able to be here with you today. I fly out, I leave here at about 4 a.m. tomorrow to catch a red eye out to California to work with one of these groups, right? And the reason that I say to the best of your ability to uh, to structure your life so that you're not under the economic or intellectual authority of white people or other non-Black people is because there are grave psychological consequences to that. And we see that all the time. Like my wife and I talk about how thankful we were that when the whole situation with George Floyd hit and the racial reckoning of 2020, I am so thankful that I did not have to go into a job to look at people who did not look like me and have to function. I mean, I literally had to counsel colleagues and friends through that who couldn't even appear on Zoom. They would have to turn their camera off because they were in tears in meetings and different things where they were just being completely disrespected. Microaggressions, macroaggressions, right? And so I want to encourage you all to the best of your ability to make sure that you can become as independent or interdependent upon each other as possible so that your livelihood is not dependent on people who don't look like you. That doesn't mean that you have to hate anybody. It doesn't mean you have to dislike anybody. It just means that you love yourself so much that you're not going to put yourself in a situation that has been proven to be detrimental to your mental health.
Mm-hmm.
Proven to be detrimental to your mental health. I'm working with my oldest son on this right now, who lives up in Connecticut. He moved up to Connecticut. He is an engineer, and he tells me some of just the asinine things that some of his coworkers say. Now he's coming from growing up in Atlanta, where my wife and I were extremely intentional about moving to Atlanta, where he could be surrounded by a normalized Black community of power, normalized Black excellence. And now he moves up there and he's surrounded by other folks who don't see that. And so, he's making his way through that. Okay. I hope that gives some insight into what you said, Mercy, and I really appreciate you sharing that. Okay. All right. Can you all bear with me for about, I wanted to take a break, but if I take a break, we won't have enough time. Can you all bear with me for about 15 to 20 more minutes? Does that work, Dr. Giddings, do you think? Or should we take a 5-minute break? What do you think?
I think we can go about 10 more minutes. Can we do 10?
Okay,
Okay.
let's see here. So let me go into this next session. What I'm going to talk to you about now is an intellectual, it's a theory, the reality of which I've seen in a number of young people that I've worked with over the years, more so in educational settings than therapeutic settings. But for me, teaching the best therapists and counselors and social workers, they teach as they provide therapy. So I hope this makes sense as we go through it. So session 4 is what is cultural identity theft and identity restoration? Dr. Naeem Akbar, in his book, Know Thyself, says the first function of education is to provide identity. Now, if we apply that to the therapeutic construct, we could say that maybe the first function of therapy is to remind the client of their identity. First function of education is to provide identity. The first function in therapy might be to remind a person of their authentic identity. Okay. A number of years ago, I was logging into my email account and the news headline of the day came up and it said, identity theft is the fastest growing crime in America. And of course, identity theft is when a person steals your personal information and uses that personal information to gain access to your resources. And psychologists have a profile for victims of identity theft. Victim becomes confused, angry, and disillusion. And I don't know about you, but I've been a victim of identity theft and have gone through all of those emotions. Confused, how did this happen? Angry, I got bills to pay and responsibilities to meet, and somebody just or locked my account. Disillusion, like what do I do, right? And the victim must spend considerable time cleaning up the mess. From going through that myself, what I learned is that we as a people have experienced what I call cultural identity theft. And that is the process of stealing a people's story, a people's perspective of history and accomplishments, and deforming their view of self and exploiting their resources. How do you take the people who gave the world reading and writing and language and literature, architecture and engineering and agriculture, astronomy, philosophy and physics, mathematics and medicine, science and technology? How do you take that group of people who gave the world all of that and convince them that they're nothing but a race of pimps, players, criminals, thugs, niggas, and bitches? Cultural identity theft. And it begins to represent itself by a range of anti-African self-destructive behaviors. And it all emerged from out of the experience of the Ma'afa. Ma'afa is a Swahili term which means great disaster, the catastrophic interruption of African sovereignty and civilization. It's not just slavery. Slavery supposedly ended in what, 1863 or 1865 after the Civil War. But the Ma'afa is still going on. The Ma'afa is still going on. There was slavery, there were Jim Crow laws, there was lynching, there was family separation, there was economic injustice, and so many other things that the Ma'afa is still going on. And so one of the things we have to be mindful of as counselors, therapists, and social workers is to help our clients to understand the difference between the alien cultural identity and our authentic identity. The alien identity is the identity of the pimps, the players, criminals, thugs, all those kinds of things that energizes self-destructive behavior. The authentic identity is the identity that's based in I am because we are, therefore I am. I can do nothing without you and you can do nothing without me. That's Ubuntu. The authentic identity is based in excellence, in achievement, in resilience, in self-determination, in overcoming, in rising above our circumstances despite the challenges. That's part of our authentic identity. But most of our people have not been exposed to that. One of my elders and advisors, Dr. Joyce King, said, Chike, it's not just cultural identity theft, it's identity replacement. And you can get paid big money in America to act like a nigga or a bitch. So there's money attached to that. And those images are placed in broad circulation to continue to contaminate others with this mental and emotional virus. Matter of fact, the more outrageous you act, the more likes that you'll get. And you can have, it may increase your chances of getting a contract for a reality TV show and other opportunities, okay? So it causes cultural confusion. It makes white folks, Asian folks, Hispanic folks, that makes them think that this is what it means to be Black. But what's most than that is it makes Black people think that this is what it means to be Black. Mm-hmm. This is a deep psychological impairment, causes cultural confusion, and what Wade Nobles and Asa Hilliard call conceptual incarceration. Many people can't even think outside of the bounds of having broken families, impoverished communities, being unemployed and underemployed, never establishing a career, going from job to job, all those sorts of things, conceptual incarceration. Asa Hilliard said, today the formal education of most people of African ancestry is usually accomplished in systems that take us far away from ourselves. So years ago, Carter G. Woodson came up with the concept of miseducation, a process of omitting truthful cultural knowledge and not preparing students for life as they will face it. And Mwalimu Baruti said miseducation leads to diseducation, and that is a process which leads the student to despise the very idea of learning. In other words, you've lied to me so much, now I don't want to learn nothing. Mm-hmm. And when you try to show them a different way, they say, we can't do that. I say, we can't do. We all niggas in here. We can't do that. They're not gonna let you do that. This is a deep psychological impairment. So education and counseling is identity restoration. Again, a big part of education and counseling is identity restoration. How do we restore people to our authentic identity and help them to see that the alien identity is not something that belongs to us? There's an African proverb that says, if the wise village elders don't teach the youth, teach and counsel the youth, the village idiots most certainly will.
Hmm.
And the village idiots are working 24/7.
Hmm.
And they're very determined. If that's not clear, I hope this makes it clear. There's another African proverb that says, if the youth are not properly initiated into the village, they will burn it down just to feel the warmth. And this is where we see our own people being self-destructive because they were never properly initiated into the village. Or because they don't own anything, they don't feel that they have a vested interest in keeping things nice. What I'm sharing with you is the work of the counselor, of the therapist, of the social worker. It's the work of the Sakusheti that I spoke about before, who knows how to illuminate the spirit, who walks into spaces, and because of the spirit and energy that they walk in, they're able to elicit a different response from people, a healing and therapeutic response from people. Before I get your aha, let me close with this. I hope that our time together has cultivated within you a different way of seeing things, okay? And this different way of seeing things can be crystallized in this last thing. And this will just take a couple of minutes here on this last little segment, okay? Um, okay, here we go. So I want us to learn to see, whoops, hold on. I'm sorry, hold on. I want us to learn to see with a different set of eyes, okay? What type of vision must we cultivate? We have to learn to see with a different set of eyes. I want to do a 30-second exercise. And in this exercise, here's the directions. This is an assessment. How many circles do you see? In just a moment, I'm going to put an image on the screen, and I want you to tell me how many. We're going to take 30 seconds, and then I'm going to ask you to put in the chat box how many circles you see. But don't put the answer until I ask for it. And when I say the circles, I'm not talking about the circles in the O, in how, or do, or you. I'm talking about in the picture I'm going to put on the screen. I'll give you 30 seconds for this, but don't put your answer in the chat box until I give you the signal, okay? Here we go. How many circles do you see? Ready, set, go. We got 30 seconds. Just think it through. "20 seconds. 10 seconds. 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. All right, please put in the chat box, how many circles did you see? Right? Let's see, 16, 16, 12. Keep them coming. Keep them coming. 12, 16. Just another second. There's several people who said 0. Another 16, another 0. 9. Okay. All right. Well, let's unpack this this activity. And first, let me apologize because when I put that image on the screen, you didn't see any circles. The first thing you probably saw was not. Just unmute yourself and say it. It's probably squares. Okay. But if you look very carefully, and this is especially for those who put 0 as their answer, and that's fine. But if you look between the squares, look at the vertical lines, right, you will start to see some circles emerge. See it there? So in reality, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16. There were, in fact, 16 circles for those of you that put that as your answer. Okay? For our purposes, those circles represent the power, the potential, the possibilities for excellence and achievement that exists within those that we serve. But most of them were not taught to see that in themselves. And with Eurocentric theories and therapeutic approaches, you might not be able to access that power, potential, or possibility for excellence and achievement either. And this is why it's important that we've had this time to share today. So here's my observations. We were all looking at the same thing, but we didn't all see the same thing. And that's because looking and seeing are two entirely different processes. I mentioned to you earlier that at one time in my life, I had a 1.9 GPA, but I had I had a dramatic intervention where somebody came into my life and showed me greater possibilities for my life. They shifted my psychology. They restored my authentic identity and helped me to see greater possibilities for my life. Looking and seeing are two entirely different processes. They saw something different when they looked at me. I saw myself as a failing student. They saw a future scholar. They helped me to bridge the gap and make the shift. We don't see things as they are. We see things as we are. And so I hope that our time together has helped you to see yourself in a different light and helps you to see those that you serve in a different light. Our ancestors said we have 3 eyes, 2 to look and 1 to see. And it's the brain that tells the eyes what to see. Those circles were there the whole time, but you might not have seen them because you hadn't been trained to see that. So a big part of the work that I do is helping counselors, therapists, social workers, teachers, professors, and leaders to see with a different set of eyes, to help them to see the greatness within themselves and those that they serve. So I'll leave you with the powerful words of Fannie Lou Hamer, who said, never forget where we came from and always praise the bridges that carried you over. And lastly, James Baldwin said, our crowns have been bought and paid for. All we have to do is put them on our heads. Thank you.
Thank you so, so very much. Let's give our dear brother, Dr. Chike Akua, a round of applause. Any comments you want to make, you can put over in the chat. This has been very inspirational. I feel like I've been to school. I feel like I've been to church. I feel like I've been to a conference. All of that in this session has been a mighty, mighty wonderful experience. I cannot wait to see the reflections that you're going to upload in Canvas in 3 weeks. I am so excited to see your feelings in writing about this wonderful and extraordinary opportunity and experience with Dr. Chike Akua. Again, Dr. Akua, we want to thank you. This has been just phenomenal. We appreciate you so much. And again, we got this talent, this history, this famous person right here at Clark Atlanta University in the School of Education. I must admit that I fell in love with this book that he mentioned. I don't know if you can see it that well, but I actually purchased the one honoring our ancestral obligations, and it has really changed my research writing efforts, as my heart has always been toward Black boys in the school system. So it has 7 steps to Black student success. If you are a parent, are you planning on being a parent? Are you planning on working with children or people who have children? You need to purchase this paperback book. He didn't ask me to tell you this, but this is a very good resource. You can drop it in your handbag or in your bag, and to help you navigate working with other people's children as well as your own children, especially Black male children. We're going to give you a break, and I think you're going to get a 5 minutes break, and then you're going to come right back so you can meet your mentors. And again, we welcome any comments that you have in the chat. We want to get these all on put it in sort of like a card and give it to Dr. Akua for his memorabilia. Thank you so much for your attention. Go take a 5 minute break and we'll be right back. Please don't log off. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing that, Dr. Giddings. And I put the
Oh, okay. Very good. I see that.
I want to order any of the books, and I
Right.
would love to hear some of the reflections once you receive those from everybody.
And when you come on the third floor, the bulletin board that we have, where we normally have a graduation board, we actually have some of his posters. That's what we use for our Black History board now. So that give you an idea of some of the other things that he has available should you want to use it. We also use it to form group counseling sessions around. So not trying to sell his work, but we need to support our own. And we can't wait till I'm saying the same thing about you. Like in 2 years, you're going to have something, or you come back and be a presenter, or you have some materials that you would like to share with other people. This is how we support one another.
Yes. Thank you all so much, and you all have a blessed day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We'll take a break, Unique.
Take a break.
You need it. You need it.
Oh, did we pause?